Politics. Our guest today is John J. Hooker. We had him talking about his Death with Dignity bill in the first part of the show. I want to talk a little bit about his life and times. John J., I think you mentioned you've been involved in Tennessee politics for maybe close to 60 years. It all started for you in terms of prominence when you were involved in the Ralston Schoolfield case. He was a judge over in Chattanooga. You and Jack Norman were asked by the governor to investigate him. He had some rather corrupt dealings. You were involved with first helping him doing the research, getting him indicted in the State House, tried and convicted in the State Senate. You were still in your 20s when you did that.
Yeah.
Did you think
First
at that
time what?
Did you think at that time you were looking at political office?
I didn't know about that time, but the first time I ever met John Stigenthaler, and I had been, I was 28 years old to be Mr. Norman's assistant. Mr. Norman was a great lawyer, and he came to my office and says, "Why do you think Mr. Norman appointed you as his assistant?" He says, "You're only 28 years old. It's a big job. Why do you think you?" I said, "Well, I hope he thinks I've got some talent and I can be useful." And he said, "Well, I want to advise you of something. That's got nothing to do with it." And I said, "What do you mean?" He said, "He employed you to keep your father, who he thinks is the best lawyer around, from representing Schoolfield." The reason you're in this case is because it's not you, but your daddy.
Now, another person that you met through this was Robert Kennedy.
He came down and testified in the Schoolfield impeachment trial.
And then later you went to work for Robert Kennedy in the Justice Department. He brought you to the Justice Department to help work on the Jimmy Hoffa case? I lived in his house for 9 months and read every single file in the Department of Justice on Jimmy Hoffa, and recommended against the Hoffa prosecution. Were you the only one in the Justice Department that recommended against
Only one. And
why?
Because I thought that Bobby was going to be accused of overreaching the gubernatorial power, that it was going to be said he was a vendetta. He and Hoffa had such vicious arguments before the legislature, and that I didn't think the case was strong enough. And so when I finally told him I wouldn't do it, it made him furious, and he stopped speaking to me for about a week. We were riding back and forth every morning in the limousine, and I said to him, I said to Ethel one night at supper, "Would you tell the Attorney General if he doesn't start talking to me, I'm going home. I'm tired of this silent treatment." And she said, "Bobby, you hear what he says, he's going home." Bobby's never said a word. Next morning he comes in, wakes me up about 5 o'clock and says, "I'm going to Chicago today." And he said, "I want you to find, if you won't do this, find me a lawyer." And I said, "You got 32,000 of your own lawyers, you find the lawyer." And he said, "Find me a lawyer." And so I called up Jim Neal, who sat next to me in law school, and got him to come over the next day to see Bobby. And ultimately, to make a long story short, Jim Neal became the prosecutor and tried Hoffa. Hoffa then fixed a jury. Bobby called me back and says, "Now, will you try the jury tampering case?" I said, "Bobby, I told you I'm not trying Hoffa, but if you really want to put him in the penitentiary, get my father." And he got my father. They got a change of venue, went to Chattanooga, and convicted Jimmy Hoffa.
Now, you were also present, I think, at history in 1960, a little earlier, during the Democratic Convention, when Robert Kennedy and John Kennedy were together, and John Kennedy told Robert that he was planning to make Lyndon Johnson his running mate. And that created an argument, too.
Yeah. Well, I happened to be in the room, and Stigenthaler and I had been down to we went together to the convention, and I happened to go into the room. Bobby was there by himself, and in a few minutes, Jack comes in the door and says in this loud voice, "I've just talked to the speaker, talking about Rabin, and he wants me to take Lyndon Johnson." Bobby said, "I don't want to do that. Telling you now, I do not want to do that." At which point Jack went into the men's room to go to the men's room, and he came back out, and I could tell by the expression, here these two brothers talking about the most important subject, that I was in the wrong place, that I had no right to be at that meeting. And I got up and I said, "Gentlemen, I believe I'll excuse myself." I got up and excused myself, but I was there when Bobby told him in words of unsyllable, "I do not want to do that." And of course Jack went on and did it anyway.
Now, not long after you met Robert Kennedy, he told you he was convinced his brother was going to be president.
Yeah.
I suspect you were convinced that Robert was going to be president, too. Could you sense the star-crossed nature of the two?
Very much. I spent a lot of time trying to talk Bobby into running in New Hampshire when Senator from Minnesota
Eugene
ran.
McCarthy.
Who?
Eugene McCarthy.
Eugene McCarthy. But then I chickened out at the last minute because I got to be afraid that Bobby was going to get assassinated if he went to New Hampshire. And And so I pulled off. And then what happened, McCarthy did what he did. Then Bobby got back in the race and ran.
And then President Johnson decided not to run.
President Johnson decided not to run. Then Bobby came to Nashville about 2 weeks before he was assassinated. And he and I were riding in the car to the airport about 5 o'clock in the morning. His little 10-year-old boy named David was sitting on my lap, and I gave him some $50,000 worth of checks. And said, I'm giving you these checks. And he said, take those to California and give them to Steve Smith. That was his brother-in-law. And little Steve, who was 10 years old and whom I had known when I lived at Bobby's house when he was 3 years old, the cutest kid I believe I ever saw, looked just like Tom Sawyer, red hair and face speckles and everything. And I took my finger like that, and I said, you know, the thing that worries me is this: be careful. And he's sitting right here in the car, and I'm sitting right here in the car, and he turns and looks at me, and he says, don't say that. He said, I've made up my mind. What will be, will be. 10 days later, I'm in New York on a business trip, turn on the television, and he gets it. And then when I ran in 70, Pat, Martin had been killed in 68, Bobby had been killed in 68. I'd go campaign in West Tennessee, and the farmers stand on the street corner. Some of them would spit, wouldn't speak to me. And I went across the street to a hat store, and the man says, if somebody wants to talk to you on the phone. And it was Buford Ellington. He said, John J. Buford says, we've got information that you're going to get assassinated this afternoon. If you look around, you'll see there are 5 of my people there. They're going to stay with you the rest of the campaign. And I said, well, I don't know if that's my best interest. Maybe that. He said, I didn't ask you if it's in your best interest. We're going to stay with you the rest of the campaign, and they did. So I ran the last 3 weeks of that campaign with the knowledge, you know, that it might be my turn, that I was over there, particularly against the war. Being against the war in Vietnam was more excitable even than civil rights. So I was over there talking about supporting the blacks and against the war in Vietnam, basically just holding up the Kennedy, Martin Luther King banner. And I was a survivor. It was 1970, and so I thought there was a good chance I might get a dose of it. But as you can see, I'm 84 years old. I'm still here.
John J. Hooker is our guest on Inside Politics. Back to continue our conversation with John J. after you watch these messages.